You talk about Eleanor going bed to bed, and I assume she visited hundreds of injured soldiers. That's hard. Walking up to someone's bedside who's injured, starting up that conversation. You don't know the person, you don't know their frame of mind. That takes great personal skills. And, they don't often talk about Eleanor Roosevelt as a charismatic figure, if you will. But she must have had an extraordinary personal touch to be able to walk up to that bedside, connect to a young man, primarily, who she had never met before, have that sense of empathy and compassion and just communication skills to develop that relationship. And it's a facet of Eleanor's personality that frankly hasn't gotten a lot of attention, but just that people skills, if you will, in relating and connecting with individuals and leaving them with the impression. And you talk about how the servicemen were so supportive of her by the end of the trip.
Yeah, well, I think that's a great point, because I think that is one of Eleanor's, one of the marvelous things about her and why she was so successful is because whether she was deep down in a coal mine or she was at Buckingham Palace, she just had this great ability to connect with everybody in every walk of life. And I do think that's because she genuinely cared. She cared about people. She cared what they had to say. And it was extraordinarily hard on her to go bed to bed in these hospital wards. And she was a class act on the outside. She's offering words of comfort or a joke. But she talks about how inside she was burning with resentment at what was being done to all of these young men. And she said that one sees the results of the war in the hospitals.
She listened, though. She listened. And she heard their concern that they wanted to make sure when they were done with the war that there would be employment opportunities, there would be jobs, and that the soldiers would be respected and have a place in society when they got back. And she followed through with that. When she came back, she lobbied just for that and was a big influence, as I take it, behind the GI Bill of Rights that was passed.
Yeah, so during Eleanor's 10 years as First Lady, she had built up this extraordinary network of outlets that she used to communicate with the American public. And I think that, she really brought that public pressure to bear on Congress to get legislation passed for the servicemen, because they needed it immediately, not after the war was done, because a great number of them were already returning. And as one serviceman told her, it would build the morale of those still on the fighting fronts to know that the country had their back. And in fact, one of them wrote to her, and she shared this in My Day, that he said that they weren't concerned about being hurt or maimed, killed, whatever. They said that their greatest concern was that when they came home and began piecing their lives back together, that they would be made to feel like suckers for the sacrifices they had made. And, Eleanor really was such a great advocate for the servicemen, and she wanted to see them taken care of for the sacrifices that they were making.
You talk in the book about the toll that it took on Eleanor. It was a 5-week trip. We talked about how difficult it was, time-consuming. Her schedule was incredible, the way you describe it, up at dawn and working virtually 24 hours a day. She lost 30 pounds and was physically exhausted at the end of the trip and mentally exhausted.
Yes, she refused to slow down while she was there. In fact, she was offered a seaside cottage in Australia to rest for a few days, and she said, no, I'll rest when I get home. I need to do everything, that she could while she was there. And she did. She lost 30 pounds while she was abroad. And she fell into a deep depression after she got home. And a close friend of hers described it, as saying it was because just of all of the witnessing the massive scale of suffering that she did took a huge emotional toll on her. but it also made her double down, and she, worked harder for the servicemen. It made her more determined to work for peace after World War II was over, so that this never happened again.
You talk about Eleanor being a lightning rod, partially because of the issues that she involved herself with. You mentioned the miners' rights, racial equality, etc., which truly were the quote-unquote, again, progressive issues of the day. And part of it was she was just not the conventional first lady, right? She was not stay at home and do the social niceties. Which was it? Was it more her politics or more her untraditional role?
I think it's both, and I think traditionally before Eleanor, first ladies before that had primarily stayed close to the White House, oversaw social functions, and they didn't take an active part in public life. But what she did was she created a unique role for herself that combined her love of travel with her sense of social responsibility. And, and that didn't set well with some people. And even 10 years in, once this trip became known, the trip to the Pacific, it was kept secret for the first 10 days. News breaks when she reaches Australia. And even then, the traditionalists are lamenting not having a more conventional first lady who knew her proper place.
You talk about Eleanor's passion for travel, her wanderlust, I believe is the word you use. Did she always have that, or was that also, let me get out of Washington and out of the spotlight for a while, and let me find myself and do my own thing beyond the shadow of FDR?
Yeah, no, that's an excellent point, and I think it's both. She talks about how she inherited a sense of adventure from her father, but also freedom, or travel embodied freedom to her and independence. And so I think it was a combination of both. And also, at the time, it was not only unusual for a first lady to be traveling in, the 1930s and 40s, it was unusual for a woman to be traveling without a man. And so the fact that she did all of this is just, yeah, she turned the role of first lady on its head for sure. Yeah.
Let's pull back the lens a little bit. This is happening in the broader context of the FDR-Eleanor relationship, which was a complicated relationship, to say the least. And it didn't get a lot of reporting at the time. I think a lot of personal details of a president and a first lady were sort of out of bounds for the press. There was some speculation, but that continues right up through the 60s, 70s, right? It's a more recent phenomenon where the press thinks that everything is fair game. But they had a complicated relationship. You tell the story. Do you think it's true that FDR's mother said when they were contemplating a possible divorce that she would cut him off if they were to get divorced? Or is that just folklore?
I do think that was part of it, yes. Just from what I've gleaned from, reading biographies about both of them, I do think that was part of it, yes. One of the things that I found while I was researching this book is that at this point in time, yes, they've had a complicated relationship. There's been, hurt, but that they still have this affectionate relationship, a friendship almost. And they cabled each other every few days while Eleanor was in the Pacific. And the notes are very affectionate. They're checking on each other's health, family members. They're making plans to see each other immediately after she returns. And that's one of the things that travel continued to be a touchstone for Eleanor and FDR, Eleanor's travels. Because after she would get back from a trip, they would get together just one-on-one, and in the days of the war, this, his time was even more, constricted. So they would get together after each of her trips. And in fact, he missed her so much after she went to England that he met her playing on the tarmac. So Eleanor's flying in, coming back from Great Britain, and she sees, all these cars and a big hoopla going on down below, and she knew that FDR had come to meet her.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to the word complicated. They are, presumably, they have intimate relations with different people, both Eleanor and FDR. They know that each other have intimate relations with other people. They start basically as a partnership because it would be impractical to get divorced. You speak about how hurt Eleanor was when she first discovered that FDR was pursuing a relationship with her social secretary at the time. So she's hurt. They can't get divorced. It would ruin the politics. The mother says they'll cut them off. So they presumably make a more pragmatic decision. We'll continue this partnership, knowing the bounds of the partnership. And they pursued that, and they did that. But there was still a genuine affection for each other, despite everything else.
Yes, and and also Eleanor always supported Franklin in his politics, in his running for office, and in fact, when he was first elected president, she was devastated for herself because she thought that she was going to lose her identity. Her identity would be absorbed into this role of first lady, but she always supported Franklin, and and she was pleased for the country when he got elected, and she said, "Well, I'm a Democrat too." And she thought he would be a great leader. So they always have had this partnership. And in fact, he was enormously supportive of her travels. He was proud of her travels, what she was doing. And she would go out there and she would gather information as what she was doing when she was crisscrossing the country. She logged 40,000 miles, an average of 40,000 miles a year on the road as First Lady, which is kind of this mind-boggling figure. And so, he benefited. Some change she would exact through her own means. Some information she would give to the president and his policy advisors. But he was always supportive of these travels. And he even said in a cabinet meeting once, he said, my missus travels a lot. And he said that she had this ability to connect with people. And he was very proud of that. And also, a year into his presidency, he asked Eleanor to go to Puerto Rico to investigate labor and living conditions. And the fact that to get there, she had to fly over water cemented her reputation as fearless and unconventional. So even in that regard, in their partnership, he was very supportive of her travels and everything.
Yeah. They talk about Eleanor as a lightning rod. You mentioned it in the book. But she must have been a net political positive for FDR, right? Yes, there were. She was controversial in some sectors, but my guess is the net effect of her involvement and her issues and her travels and her advocacy helped FDR's political effort.
Yes, and and as you mentioned earlier, he's a progressive as well, and so she's out there doing, I think, a lot of the things that he was supportive of politically and wanted to see happen, and also people couldn't tell him like she had the real time information that she was gathering on the ground versus maybe what other people siloed in Washington were telling him, and in that regard, I think it was super valuable because she had the pulse of the nation. And in fact, she said that when she became First Lady, that how she thought she could best help FDR was by being his listening post and by keeping him in touch with public opinion, which she said is the moving force in a democracy. And that's what she was out there doing while she was meeting with, people in their own communities and finding out what they wanted and what they needed.
Well, maybe, look, FDR's mobility is limited, right, for physical reasons, as well as the job itself by its nature. So part of the arrangement is that works for both is, Eleanor, you go out, you travel, you meet people, you get the feel on the ground. you are the physical presence across the country that FDR couldn't be. That makes sense for both of them, no?
Absolutely. And in fact, this kind of a partnership was actually something that began while he was governor of New York State, because they would go visit state institutions and he could drive around the grounds, but he sent Eleanor in to inspect inside the facilities. And she talks about how he really taught her how to write reports and what to look for. You know, is what's on the menu corresponding with what's actually cooking in the pots in the kitchen. And she says that at first her reports were unsatisfactory to him, but she learned how to do this and really, have this eye, for detail and for asking questions. And that partnership even precedes their days in the White House.
I have a sense that politically she was even more progressive, if you will, than FDR, or let's say less limited than FDR, right? You have the theory of progressive politics, and then you have the reality of progressive politics. And Eleanor had the freedom to advocate for causes where FDR was more limited by what he could actually accomplish or what was politically palatable. So it seemed like she was on the point more than FDR in pushing some of these more progressive causes.
Yeah, no, I absolutely think that's true. Racial issues being one of them, he needed the support of Southern Democrats and, so often was not as vocal on issues of race and social justice like she was. And one of the things about the Pacific trip is, she already had this great, impressive platform. She held women-only press conferences. She had her column. She gave speeches across the country, radio addresses. And then the Pacific trip comes around and the media just exploded around this trip even more so. And she used it to address these issues, issues of race, women becoming more involved in civic life, particularly to help keep the peace after the war. And yes, so she was much more free than FDR was to publicly speak about all of these things.
Yeah. One of the issues, and it's a little bit afield from the subject of your book, during World War II, on the other side of the world, there was a terrible problem, obviously, with the Nazis and Jewish persecution. And FDR apparently knew about the prison camps, concentration camps that were being built, and has been criticized for not being more aggressive, that they knew the rail tracks were being built to the concentration camps, and people said, why didn't the American bombers bomb those tracks to stop that? And it was complicated politically at the time, because you can look back now and say, of course, that was the right thing to do. But FDR had to battle with what was a real sense of anti-Semitism in the country at that time. And he did not want the rationale for America entering the war to be to protect the Jewish community, because he thought he couldn't have enough political support for it. We literally had ships coming to the United States with refugees that were turned away and sent back. I've never read anything about Eleanor anywhere in those conversations. You didn't come across anything in that regard.
Yeah, well, my research was taking me in a different direction, but I did come across something that I do believe that she was trying to do help with refugees, and she did run into problems with the State Department, because she only had so much, that she could do at the time.
Last question. We're talking 1943. We're talking the 30s. We're talking about a total different period of time in terms of female empowerment and acceptance. But yet, it seems like Eleanor Roosevelt did more with the role of First Lady than you could argue anyone since. You had Hillary Clinton, strong personalities. I was in the Clinton administration. She took the healthcare initiative. She was a lightning rod for being in charge of the healthcare initiative. Michelle Obama did great work in the White House. But you could argue that Eleanor Roosevelt did more with the role and was more expansive with the role, especially considering the time, than any First Lady since.
Well, I'm probably biased because I wrote an entire book about Eleanor Roosevelt, but I completely agree. And I think part of that was this unconventionality. And she wrote a whole article, How to Take Criticism. And she basically said that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So you may as well do what you believe in. And, you know, I think that, yeah, she broke the mold in a really incredible way. And the Pacific trip is just one example. And in fact, a reporter at the time described her trip to the Pacific as the most remarkable journey any president's wife has ever made. And I think that still stands. And I think it's just so indicative of how she changed everything. You know, she did do things like she was appointed to the Office of Civilian Defense, which made her the first presidential spouse to hold an official government position. It was unpaid. And yet she had to resign because, yes, this controversy that erupted over it and stuff like that. But yeah, I think Eleanor was extraordinary, and I don't think there's been anyone else in our history like Eleanor Roosevelt.
Yeah, and the credit goes to both of them. FDR had to be willing to take the heat, and he took a lot of heat. Lightning rod, etc. But he took a lot of heat for Eleanor, her political positions, the role that she played. But he was willing to take it. And again, back to complicated, despite all the personal complications, he was willing to do that and bear that burden. And it was her, but fundamentally it was her, you know. She is doing this on her own accord. It's her initiative. It's her work ethic. And it's her courage. You touch in the book that she was not naturally a politician. She didn't have natural political skills. She had a fear of public speaking. She didn't enjoy the criticism, you know. Not that anybody ever enjoys the criticism. And, you know, they say develop a thick skin. Not really. But it took a personal toll. And but she was developed and actualized enough as a person that she did it despite the pain and despite the fear. And she overcame her fears in those regards to do the job.
Yeah, those are both, you know, excellent points. You know, going back to FDR, yes, if he weren't supportive of Eleanor doing this, she probably wouldn't have been doing as much, certainly. And he benefited politically, but he also knew that she needed this personally and that this was very important to her. And, you know, overcoming a fear of public speaking, you know, getting out of your comfort zone. Her desire was always, and this is what is so incredible about her, her desire was always to make society better and to make life better for individual people.
Yes, but she was willing to do it at her own expense. You know, we often think that, people have who do these things, it's easy for them. Or they're naturals at it. No, we all have fears. We have insecurities. And the trick is, are you willing to overcome those fears for the greater good? And in the balance, do you put the good that you can accomplish above the personal cost and the personal risk and the personal weaknesses? Will you get past your weakness for the greater good? Will you endure the pain for the greater good? And she, I think, is just a marvelous example of someone who really was that sincere and that authentic in her desire to achieve and accomplish social change, that she paid a tremendous personal price and pushed herself to do things that she was not naturally comfortable doing.
I think that's perfectly said, and that's exactly what the Pacific trip was. It was hard on her. It took a lot out of her. She pushed herself. It ravaged her physically, mentally, but she did it because of the greater good.
Yeah, and that's really, I think, her greatest legacy. You know, public service is, if you are sincere and you believe it, and it is about doing good for others and not about you. It's not about your ego and your ambition and your need and your insecurities. If it really is about other people and doing good for other people, if you can get to that place, you can be enormously effective. And that is the story of Eleanor Roosevelt. And I think I have 3 daughters who were in their mid-20s. And Eleanor's story is, I think, so powerful and such a guide for any woman who wants to say, I want to make a change, I'm interested in public service. Read Eleanor Roosevelt and understand who she was and what she did and why she did it. And that's for women and for men. I think a lot of the lessons of Eleanor apply to all of us. And I know that I saw a lot of aspects of myself in reading about Eleanor's journey. I thought you did a magnificent job with it, and not just telling the story about the specific trip, which is fascinating in and of itself, but also bringing in the full context of the relationship with FDR and the times and where the country was and the political state. So I thank you so much for your work and for your accomplishment. And I think there's a lot, not only is it an enjoyable read and informative, but there are a lot of lessons on a personal level for all of us in that book.
Well, thank you so much for your kind words about the book, and I'm glad that you enjoyed journeying with Eleanor to the Pacific.
It was my pleasure. And I recommend it to all our listeners. Once again, the First Lady of World War II. You will enjoy it. I promise you. Shannon, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.